The intersection of technology and consumers is more prevalent today than it has ever been before. And while many of us continue to utilize the benefits of predictive technology, we're still slightly uncomfortable with how it seeps into our lives. This growing dichotomy often leaves us asking one important question: can I trust this technology? Luckily, Michael Biltz, the managing director at Accenture Labs, is here to answer that question and ease some of our concerns. On this episode of IT Visionaries, he discusses Accenture's Technology Vision 2020 report, the brewing technology clash between consumer and trust, and how the robot renaissance is upon us. Enjoy this conversation. IT Visionaries is created by the team at mission.org and brought to you by the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Build connected experience, empower every employee, and deliver continuous innovation with the customer at the center of everything you do. Learn more at salesforce.com/platform. This podcast is created by the team at mission.org.
Welcome to IT Visionaries. I'm Ian Faison, host of IT Visionaries. We have special guests. Michael, what's going on?
Hey, hi Ian, how are you?
I am doing well. Excited to talk to you about everything that is going on at Accenture Technology Labs today and get into your background. So let's get into it. How did you first get started in technology?
Yeah, actually, I fell into it. You know, the job with Accenture was one of those. I was planning on going to medical school, was looking to save up money before I did it, and I fell into tech and programming, and I kind of never looked back.
So flash forward to today, what is the Accenture Technology Labs for folks that don't know, and what's the scope of your role?
Yeah, so Accenture's Technology Labs, we're in a really interesting position because we're a consulting company, not a traditional tech company. And so we've got 500,000 employees over, I think, just about every country in the world and just about, every industry. And we've got this really interesting place in the marketplace that our job is to help companies add tech to whatever they're trying to do. And it means we've got this broad view, everything from artificial intelligence to robotics to virtual reality, and more. And what our labs is really set up is to make sure that we stay ahead of the curve, is that we're not always necessarily inventing, the newest VR headset or something like that, but rather we're looking to try to figure out how all this technology that's produced by startups and academia and all of these big companies actually gets translated and used by real businesses to help, make your supply chain more efficient, to figure out, how to use augmented reality in order to, wire wind turbines better. But all of those things of the practicality of how does this stuff get used, we're looking ahead 5+ years, to understand how those things are going to change and how these things really should be implemented, by, every big company across the world.
Well, I can tell you that, a lot of our listeners and guests, CIOs and CTOs, are constantly trying to stay up to date on the latest tech trends, to figure out how their companies are going to be shaped by technology, whether they're a technology company or not. From an overarching viewpoint in this, like, how do you go about keeping up with everything that's going on? How do you stay up to date with everything?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that it's a full-time job. I mean, and I think it's one of the interesting things is that for many years, and so I've been with Accenture for 22, 23 years now, and I think the most common question I used to get in the early my career is, why on earth does a consulting company have a lab? And I think it's exactly for that reason that you said, is that there's so much changing from a tech perspective, from an IT perspective in the marketplace, is that you really need people whose full-time job is dedicated to being at conferences, to talking to academia and academics, to having researchers on staff, looking into what's real and what's not, and how it's really pushed out there. And so we do it, primarily by, I'm going to say, throwing lots of people, time, and effort into making sure that we're connected into everything that's going on. And I think that we doubly in a unique position in the marketplace, that says that because we work with, I want to say the last count was something like 98% of the global 2000 companies, is that the fact that we actually have our hands in relationships with all these big companies, in every industry in most countries in the world, gives us a relatively unique way for us to leverage not just, conferences and our network and people out there, but actually to leverage all of our experts within these fields, in order to kind of funnel it down to us to try to distill that really hard question of it's not just what's happening, it's what are the important things that I can focus on and what are the things that I need to be prepared for right now.
When you publish a really weighty report every year, and this year, Technology Vision 2020. Well, tell me a little bit about the report, and then we'll get into some things that interested you or surprised you particularly.
Yeah, I mean, the report really, it started out as a look for ourselves in order to try to guide what our research was done, within our technology labs. And I think particularly, as we started to get into the mid 2000s, what we realized is that every company was realistically starting to become a technology company. And the amount of tech that, whether you're an insurance company or a car manufacturer, or Procter and Gamble, is that suddenly everybody was expected to be tech savvy and using all of these new tools. And so it eventually morphed from a internal thing to us really publishing, I'm going to say, the skinny down version of what's actually changing in technology. But I think more importantly to that is the business layer on top of that that says, why do we actually care about that? And so we do an enormous amount of effort in interviews. We have an advisory board from, a bunch of different firms, external to Accenture. We talk to academia, and then we do a giant survey, for the purpose of trying to distill down, what's changing, and how that's going to impact, most businesses. And what it turns into is, I think this year was a 150-page report, which sounds like a lot, but we make a real big effort to, tell lots of stories, give lots of examples, and, make it as practical as we can.
Well, we'll link it up in the show notes and highly recommend if our listeners haven't checked it out that they do that. But let's, in the sake of time, let's TLDR this thing for our listeners now. What were some of those tech trends that you saw that were particularly interesting?
Yeah, I think honestly the most interesting one that we really saw this year, and we'll call it a tech trend, even though it's tech adjacent, is that there's been a real big shift over the last 18 months in how companies are viewing both technology and how they're viewing their role in our economies and our societies. To nobody's surprise is that usually when we talk to C-level executives, their laser focus is on revenue, their position in the marketplace, their profits, and their shareholders. And I think what's been really interesting is that over the last 18 months, as we've seen tech become so pervasive, in our companies and also in our lives. I mean, think about the Uber, think about, as we're sitting here, in COVID, using all of our telepresence, every day, is that we're starting to see companies realize that the more that we touch on our consumers' lives, the more that we embed ourselves into the everyday, pieces of our family, is that it's not just the value that technology is providing that we care about anymore. It's also the values that these things are pushing forward. I think the big shift is not that that hasn't always been important, but I think what's happening now is that it's consistently becoming a C-level conversation. And we're seeing more companies, that are talking about what role they have or what role that they should be playing, as this technology gets implemented. So I'll give you an example is that, you take a company like AT&T, is the AT&T, over the last, few years has been, doing a huge amount of digital transformation. And what they've realized is that the skills that they're going to need from all of their employees are, vastly going to start to change. There's the questions of, some jobs are going to be automated. But as a piece of that, they're also making a huge push that says, well, it's the value that says, yeah, automating something like a job is, going to be, beneficial to the company, but they also have values around how they support their employees. And so they're in the process of taking, tens of thousands of employees, to retrain them for that next generation of the job. And it's that balance of value and values that I think is something that we're starting to see, pop up, more and more from a company perspective in their planning of what they want to do, as well as the consumer's perspective for what they're expecting out of big companies.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about personalization, particularly because this is an extremely hot topic right now, specifically in marketing, where you have, all pretty much every marketer trying to figure out what their strategy is for personalization. You have the consumer, like is kind of mentioned in your report, where you have 66% of people that are concerned about, how folks are essentially doing personalization. They're just as concerned about commercial use of their personal data and online identity as they are about security threats and hackers. So, again, this is a huge topic right now and everyone's trying to figure it out. But when you do it right, it's really, really good. And when you do it wrong, it's not so good. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on personalization in the marketplace now?
Yeah, personalization, it's a really good example of, what we're seeing as a generalized trend and what we're calling a tech clash is that people like technology. We'll start with that. For as much as people worry about technology spying on them, they worry about things like personalization. The reality, the first one that we had to come to grips with is the people aren't not using tech. We don't see people buying less online. We don't see them dropping their social media accounts and things of that standpoint. But what we are seeing is the expectations for what's coming out of that is really going higher. And so when you start to see people's concerns, their concerns aren't necessarily from something like personalization. In fact, the when you do it right, that says when I log on to a website and it understands what my history and the last things that I've bought, and it provides me an easy way to re-up my groceries or find the exact shoe or sunglasses that I want, is that those types of things are actually very well received by users. The problem is that we're not necessarily aligning those things with the other expectations the consumers have. That says well, where did you get this information from? Who are you sharing it with? And those are that big question that says what we're doing from a personalization is only half the equation. Is that the personalization side of it has all the benefits, but what's often missing is that relationship and that trust with the company. And it's that second piece, that we're starting people, to see, the companies that are getting good at this, realize. And so when we start talking about tech clash, we're seeing that it's not a anti-technology movement that we're seeing come forth. Rather it's that realization that says if you're going to take your technology and you're going to seep into my life, to understand what my kids preferences are, or what my family wants to do on the weekend, those types of things have crossed into a line that says now we're not just talking about data pushing back, we're talking about a trust that needs to be established that says, how do we get both out of it? That says, a consumer wants that technology and those services too, but they also require that trust along with it, to make sure that they're comfortable, with the exchange, because that exchange is, in this particular case, data for services.
What about AI? This is something that every single guest that we bring on the show has either thoughts on AI or feels like they should have more thoughts on AI, and it means a million different things. What did you see in the report from an AI perspective?
I think AI is actually coming a long ways. And one of the interesting things that we've really seen a shift in is I think when most people think about artificial intelligence, what they tend to think about is automation. How do I take things that used to be, something that people do, and allow machines or an AI chatbot or other things of that standpoint, take its place. But one of the things that we're really seeing a shift for this year is how AI is working with people more. And the interesting thing is that not only does it I'm going to say allay some of the concerns that people have about artificial intelligence taking their jobs, is that it's also incredibly productive, because the things that people are good at and the things that artificial intelligence are good at tend to be different things. So let me give you an example. So Volkswagen is in the process of redoing their 1962 VW wagon. So I think everybody can close their eyes and picture a Woodstock-like scenario and imagine what this car looks like. To nobody's surprise, it's very important for VW and the designers that you maintain this classic look. I mean, because that's why they're trying to revive it. That's the purpose of the whole effort in the first place. But the reality is that, well, that's a car from the 60s. I mean, everything from fuel efficiency to modern technology to safety equipment and all the things that absolutely would need to be in a new car suddenly need to be designed into this thing. One of the big issues that they were worried about was something like weight. So old time cars, there's lots of steel in the world, prices were low, fuel economy was not something that anybody was worried about. And so you had these giant heavy cars on the road. And so what VW is doing is they're using their designers to actually collaborate with AI within Autodesk's platform. And so what the AI is doing is it's taking part by part things like the rims and the wheel wells to reimagine a huge iterative design of how are all the ways that I could design this to pull weight out. And the neat thing about it is that suddenly you end up with this interesting collaboration where you've got designers who are basically saying, all right, here are the pieces that we really need to make sure that this thing still looks like that classic VW bus that we want. But you use AI to say, but I don't really have the capacity or the ability or the interest to go through a million different permutations of what something like a wheel rim would look like in order to maximize strength, but minimize something like weight. And so you've got this AI that's basically doing that thing for them. And so as they go through together, they're essentially able to create something that is better, more fuel efficient while still stylish, than either one of them would have been able to individually create on their own. And it's this type of collaboration, that we're seeing between people and AI in order to get things done that's really started to become more prevalent.
With regards to security, you have said that cybersecurity is no longer an individual company effort. It needs to be cooperation with ecosystem partners. This is fascinating to me. And the research from the reports that 87% of business and IT execs agree that they want to be truly resilient organizations and to rethink approaches to security. What is the ecosystem play for cybersecurity?
Yeah, so the ecosystem play is actually really interesting, because there's a certain amount that says we're so tied to all of our ecosystem partners, is that there's data coming in and out. I mean, just think about something as simple as like a supply chain. If you are building a car, you are, importing, seats from Faurecia, you're importing, sound systems from Bose, and a million other companies. And so all of these, both parts and the physicality of these things are coming together, to have a car assembled. But the reality is that all of the data associated with all these things are doing it too. And so you end up in this interesting environment where you're suddenly sharing all of your data. But what happens is when you do that, you realize that your security is no longer just dependent on the data that you have. Rather, it's dependent on the data that all of your partners potentially have about you. And you're only as safe as that weakest link. So an example is that a few years back, there was a SEC scandal where there was a huge bust on insider trading. And what they found, was that they busted a ring of insider tradings that had basically been operating for more than 5 years. And we're talking about, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, in insider trading that was going on, sophisticated to the point, that people were logging on like a shopping cart type thing to grab which data you wanted before it happened, before the press releases, before your earnings reports, before all of the big announcements, in order to be able to grab it and use it to trade. Now, once they figured it out, is that they started to dig in to figure out, well, what was the real breach? And the interesting part about it was that the companies that they were insider trading on they weren't the companies that were breached. Rather, they had actually got into the Associated Press, to Reuters, and to all of the other companies that, were passing their data on. And so essentially
Wow.
what they were doing is grabbing data from a huge amount of companies, by essentially attacking that weakest link. And this is kind of where our new reality is that, every time we connect to somebody, it becomes a realization that says, if you're connecting to them to grab data, that's an into your system. And frankly, the way you're also going to have to look at it is that you're also an into their system too. And so it's that new way that says you're going to have to start looking at this as an ecosystem, as a partnership, which is something that most companies aren't doing right now.
That's fascinating. We've had a bunch of guests on here talking about zero trust, what that means, why it's so important. How does zero trust play into this?
You have to have some amount of trust, but it's always trust and verify. There's a certain amount of, I think what the zero trust philosophy goes into, is that you can't rely on everyone else, when it's your security that's on the line. And I think it's why we see folks like Siemens, for example, that are doing audits. They're doing audits, not regulation, not somebody else. They're doing audits, for compliance, both on a security side, as well as on a regulation and privacy side. And I think that's going to really start to become, the norm here, is that, when we start thinking about standards and we start thinking about things that I think everybody's used to, like service level agreements, because essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to build that trust, but I think it's also a matter, of the reality of what the marketplace is. So here's the reality of the marketplace, which is why I think, everybody has such concerns on this, is that there is no such thing as 100% security. Anything can and will be, if you have enough effort and or desire to hack, can get hacked. And then I think the other side of it is that no matter how much money you have to throw at your security, you're never going to be able to secure everything. And so everybody's playing this really interesting game of a risk-based approach to security. So it's a question of, what are the things that I find the most vulnerable or the most valuable or the most detrimental if they were destroyed? So that may be credit cards for somebody. It may be, designs to a new airplane if you're Boeing. The problem around that is that what may be most important to you, it may not be most important to what your partners are. And that's a very different way to look at it. And so what you're really talking about is opening up a communication channel with your partners to make sure you understand what their interests, priorities, and vulnerabilities are, and match them to yours. So I'll give you a fun example. There was a fitness band that was on the market that was used to track things like your runs, locations, your fitness level, how much activity that you did, what your heart rate was, going through it. And there was an interesting scandal that went on that said that there was a particular army base that had a large number of soldiers that were using this. And for somebody like a fitness company, the idea that you would have a geolocation, and a mapped running trail for what you would do that's a low priority thing that they're not particularly worried about if other people know. And it turned out is that there were folks who were using that information in order to track troop movements. And it's one of those things that you go back and forth and says if you're only looking at some of these things in isolation, something that can be very small for one company, can be very big for another, which says in this case is the troop movements, for a U.S. base, that's something that's incredibly classified material. A runner's movement for an individual is something that nobody would think twice about.
That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, as someone who spent a decade in the Army, I can tell you that that would that is not great. And as someone who worked in strength management and reporting for for soldiers, that gives me nightmares. That's crazy. That's an interesting thing. I mean, and you figure, their phones are, already going to be doing that in some form or fashion.
Yep.
But you can buy a connected device for whatever, $10 and have that sort of thing. That's really interesting. Wow. So what are the kind of like, what can folks do about things like that? Like what's the actual, how can organizations, combat those sort of things, specifically with like IoT, which is borderline impossible to have a fully secure, perimeter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of it is actually not, I'm going to say it's challenging and it's expensive, but it's honestly, most of it is just starting with the basics, and it's that realization that says most companies are not sharing information with their partners. When they get hacked, they're not passing that on to everybody else. When they find trouble that's happening and they have resolutions to it, they're not sharing that information. Similarly, they're also not sharing information around what their priorities are. What are the things that they need to protect? What are the things that they need to do? And so a lot of it, just comes down to the fundamentals that says, well, the same way that you're coordinating internally between your departments around who has access to what and where it goes and when it goes and where those crux points are that you should really be checking to what's normal or not, is that all of those same things need to be done externally. And then I think that once you get to that point that you're actually talking about it, then it becomes that shared responsibility that says, all right, well, whose job is it, to be looking at this data as it's going back and forth? Who's coordinating, where the investments are, where those choke points are, who's responding for that information, and who has the ability to actually look across these two different networks in order to figure out if there's something wrong versus only looking at your siloed pieces. And so this is really, how am I going to create that security relationship, across companies, and across multiple ecosystems. And once you get to that standpoint, then a lot of the same strategies that you're using internally, are likely going to be used externally. It's just a lot more additional cooperation, a lot of additional negotiation. Sometimes, it's a lot of different contracts that says, what standards are you going to be holding your partners to make sure that, they're making the investment, even though they might not be the ones particularly at risk.
Let's talk robots. This is an exploding field, it's exploding in a good way. The report estimates it's going to be over $241 billion market by, I think, 2022 here, 2023. You have in the report that 48% of consumers surveyed believe that robots are poised to make their lives easier, but 39% are concerned that they'll introduce more problems than they fix. When we talk about robots, I guess, first off, is this report referring to robots in a physical sense or a digital sense, or both?
I mean, it's definitely going to be both, but I think in this particular one, we're focused on that physical sense of a robot. As I think most people are aware that, chatbots and AI and all of the things on the back end are happening and will continue to happen. But I think it's kind of a surprise to most people to realize that I'll call it the revolution that we had 30 years ago, where manufacturing plants essentially, more and more robotics were being placed in them, we're in the process now about to have that same thing happen, but have it happened in the real world. And what we've noticed is that almost under the covers is that when you start looking at, I'm going to say, all of the industries that most people don't have direct access to, those things are happening already. So if I go onto a mining site, there are already automated trucks completely driving around, carrying dirt back and forth, from all of the dig sites. The mining equipment, it's the every dangerous situation you can imagine, is suddenly replacing, robots, with people, in order to make sure that they're protecting their lives. Is that you look at things like agriculture that says the everything from picking to planting to monitoring, is that more and more of our agricultural systems, are using, large scale robotics. And this is really happening everywhere. And I think what's surprising to folks is, one, that it's happening everywhere, and two, that it's getting to a point that what we're seeing now is the first wave into consumer things. So if you go to different Walmarts in the U.S., for example, is that you're more and more likely to see a robot mopping the floor or a robot slowly moving down the aisles and taking inventory, and that's really becoming, the norm. This idea of, what we're calling robots in the wild is something that we always knew was coming, but it just seemed to have been stalled for so long, that people just kind of shook their head. And I think what we haven't realized is that over the last number of years is that both artificial intelligence, the rollout or the beginning of the rollout of 5G is really starting to open those floodgates. And so we're just at the starting line where we're going to start to see and have robots, interacting more and more with us on our daily lives.
I mean, is that going to mean something for like the end consumer, or is that just more for the business? Because like like you've seen some of the robotic cafes and stuff like that. I mean, like, again, maybe there's more of, the like X Cafe X or whatever it is, things like that. But it just feels like we're still pretty far ways off from like actually interacting with robots in the wild.
I mean, we're starting it. And I think that's the point, is we're starting from a business perspective that says if you go to a hospital, you're more and more likely to have a robotic surgeon, and that's something that's, ramping up. Yeah, you're seeing some, I'm going to say, hotels that are doing, using robotics, at their front desk. You're seeing some cafes and baristas and bars and other things at that standpoint, using robotics. But I think the point is you're starting to see those happen. And I think what's really interesting is that when we originally started talking about this 8-9 months ago, this was one of those ones that we were basically raising the flag to everyone that says these things are rapidly starting to happen on the business perspective. And we're seeing the first people dip their toes into, I think Domino's in Houston, is looking at a automated way to deliver their pizza. But we're starting to see these things creep into our lives, and they seem relatively far away. But I think particularly when you start to look at, where we are right now, with COVID, as right now I'm currently, sequestered at home, is that the comfort level that people have with robotics, I think, is getting more and more because they're seeing the value of them, particularly, in this crisis state. And I also think that while companies are trying to maintain the social distancing, everything at that point, is that all of these projects that they've had in their works, and whether those are pilots or in the background, are rapidly being accelerated. And so it's one of those things that says I can see why the average person or the average consumer feels like this is something that's way in the future. But the reality is that, companies have been doing these things for themselves for a long time, and I think that, essentially the environment that we're in is likely going to accelerate it. And that may be a few years off, before you see it on a everyday basis, but I think it's one of those things that, while we're talking to companies, you're talking about a vastly different type of, how do I maintain these things? What type of skills do I have to build these things? What does customer support mean? If I've got robots breaking down on the side of the road, and all of those, complications to it, that says it's a big enough change for companies to think about, that the investment and the thought process that they need to have about these, really needs to start now.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I do think that, much in the way that certain robots and like chatbots and, the digital robots are kind of passing the Turing test. I think that feels like it's almost impossible for, consumerized robots to be able to do that. I don't know, maybe there's some examples where that's not the case, but I'd imagine that the frustration level is a huge part of that, right? Where you just don't want to, make people mad. Hey, we're trying to help, but this isn't really ready for prime time. And I think if you look at driverless cars, for example, where you have the user experience of getting in a driverless car and it taking you where you need to go is essentially the exact same, right? Like there's not, you have a trust factor and a fear factor and potential hesitancies and all that sort of stuff that goes into it. But from a utility standpoint, like, you get there. If robots are delivering your packages, right? You don't interact with the robot. You just have a package sitting there, or your food, or whatever it is. But if there's like that level of social interaction where then you might have it might show at the seams. Yeah, it's fascinating. This is it's a really interesting time, and for that particularly, because I think maybe not in a year, but in 5 years, it's probably going to look totally different.
It is, and I think that's the important thing, though, is that there's a certain amount of in between that I don't think most people are expecting. I think you said it yourself, we're almost expecting that Turing test that says, this robot is going to be my friend and I'm going to have a relationship and they're going to be able to do everything. And I think that's probably not what we're going to see. It's going to be similar to, the Roombas that we've seen today, is that they are going to be robots. They are going to act and interact with the world, but they're going to do it in a limited fashion. And so, whilst, we're very far away from the idea that says, I'm going to have a robot in my house that, is my maid and my cook and, does all of the odd handyman jobs, that's probably, a longer time away, but the idea that suddenly actions and interactions on a very normal basis that says, might they be checking me out at the grocery? Yeah, they might. Might they be helping, to mop my floors? Well, they're kind of doing those things now. Might be my barista as the yeah, I think what we're seeing is that, we're moving down that same path that says we're going to start with very specific things, and those are going to become more and more common. And the fact of the matter is a lot of the things that, are, robotics or robotic like, because with the intelligence that they're putting in them, are something that we just don't view that way. Because, when we close our eyes and we imagine a robot, we imagine, Mr. Data from Star Trek, versus, a washing machine that's actively sensing and changing the cycle to make sure that it cleans and doesn't damage my clothes.
The world is in a crisis with COVID. It seemingly changes every day depending on what is going on. I'm curious, just how do you think about leading through a crisis with your team and with all of the folks that you work with at Accenture?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things that, I think the first is honestly, it's as simple as recognizing that this is really a huge change, and, for us personally, it's obviously the change that says I'm not with my coworkers and the people who work for me, every day anymore. It's a realization that things from a life, are happening to everybody, and so you have to be concerned about working hours, health, mental health, and all of those types of things, that were, not that they weren't important before, but we're going through so many changes right now, and there's so much stress and pressure, everybody in the world it's one of those things that's really become, more front and center, while at the same time, the amount of, physical contact you have with people is basically, reduced to zero. And that's kind of the personalized side of things. And so there's a certain amount of, I feel like we're almost recreating new relationships, through technology. I'm using Zoom in my video cameras, and I recognize that even that is I'm very blessed to be able to do it all, and that's almost a tribute to how lucky I am to still have my job. How lucky we are to be in a position to have an internet connection, and the ability to do those things. While so many people are struggling to make money, struggling from how do they educate their kids if they don't have an internet connection. How much is being lost, just via the fact that we're all dealing with this crisis. So yeah, we're all doing the best that we can. But what's particularly fascinating are weirdly, what's happening now, is particularly impacting my team, and our jobs, because it's our jobs to figure out what's changing with people, what's changing with society, and specifically what's changing with technology, and how that's going to drive people to a different perspective. Whereas normally these changes, we're talking, year over year, that says here's 3 to 5 years out and what's gradually going to change, is that we've suddenly come into this environment where we're being asked now, to try to understand, this global crisis that we're going through and how that's going to change the way, that technology is used. And so it's interesting that, we're trying to balance, I'm going to say, both the fact that you need to be sensitive to what people are going through, compassionate and understanding to making sure that their health, is a priority, to making sure that we do what we can to help overall. But from the same standpoint is that we're also really on those front lines of rethinking what is this world going to look like, and how do people need to act and react differently, and how do businesses need to start to take into account technology and how it's going to be used, at this point as a nice to have, but how do I use it to save my business? How do I use it so that people can still get work done? How do I use it so that, companies like, GE can redo their plants in order to build ventilators? And these are the types of things that we're working through right now. And I think it's important, for us to realize that, that ideas and that thought leadership of, trying to guide people, first, is squarely on our plate, and something that we believe, is our privilege and right, and responsibility, to try to help people, through this as best as we can.
Okay, let's get into our lightning round. These questions are fast and easy, just like the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Go to salesforce.com/platform to learn more. Lightning round questions. Michael, are you ready?
I'm ready.
#1, what app on your phone is the most fun?
Right now, Zoom.
What is your hidden talent or passion?
I make beer.
Oh yeah, and favorite beer?
I'm currently making a grapefruit IPA.
Wow, that's fun. How did you get into beer making?
I kind of just fell into it. I've got a cousin who has been doing it for years, and his beer taste is so bad that I feel like I've tasted so many bad beers that I was convinced that I could do it better myself. And so we made one with a few friends of mine after a party, and we've never looked back since.
What is your favorite thing to cook or eat?
Ribs, 100% ribs. There's a soft spot in my heart for anything barbecued, but I don't think I could live a life without ribs.
What book or podcast are you binging these days?
So weirdly enough, I'm rereading Moby Dick, and it's been super fun and fascinating, just because I feel like when I first read it, it was one of those things that somebody had to almost at gunpoint point me towards. And now I'm realizing that, this was actually could have been, one of the more fun activities as I was going through school, and hell, now I'm doing it voluntarily.
Yeah, there's so many like books like that where you go back and read and you're like, I probably should have read this in my 20s when it actually is relevant to me, and not when I was like 13, when it's like I have zero life experience. Because when you're 13, you are like, I want to go, screw around with my friends.
Exactly.
What is your best advice for a first-time CIO or CTO?
That's a good question. I think my best advice for a first-time CIO and CTO is that your goal is to implement change. Is that I think what's, and this is not just, from a current environment around COVID, but rather a general environment that we've seen over the last number of years, is that the largest mistake that we see, happen in the marketplace is that everybody wants so bad to have that perfect answer that perfect solution that's going to make everything better is that they freeze. And the more that you're standing still, the more that everybody's, moving away without you. Yeah, and so there's a certain mentality, that I've seen that works best in the CIO and the CTO department, which is really I don't have to be perfect, I just have to be better than the guy next to me. And that mentality, really pushes you to constantly move and constantly change, knowing that the beauty of IT right now is the resiliency and the agility, and the flexibility to be able to change as you go. And so, the more that you can keep pushing to move forward, I think the better off you will be.
What question do you never get asked that you wish you were asked more often?
Data veracity. So I think my big underlying kick that I wish people would talk more about, is how we determine truth in data. And I don't mean that just from a news and media perspective, but there's this interesting piece that says that people lie. I read an article, like the last stat that I said, showed that, something on the order of they did a survey for patients. So now you're talking about people who are at a doctor, who is, by law, going to keep all of your information confidential, and then you have your health at stake, to tell them the truth about what's going on, and I think that, more than a quarter of them, admitted to, telling their doctors a lie. And it's this really interesting piece that we have that says that we're in this process of building this world fundamentally based off of data, understanding people, understanding what's going on, and using data to drive most of our decisions. But I think that the amount of time and effort that people are making to make sure that their data is accurate, that their data is true, and their data is, verified as much as we can, is almost criminally underrepresented.
That's it. That's all we got. Michael, thanks so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. Any final thoughts? Anything to plug?
No, I mean, if you guys are interested in technology, you want to understand where the world's going, I suggest, you go to www.accenture.com/technologyvision, and if you have thoughts or comments, definitely reach out to me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, and we'll talk soon.
IT Visionaries is created by the team at mission.org and brought to you by the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Build connected experience, empower every employee, and deliver continuous innovation with the customer at the center of everything you do. Learn more at salesforce.com/platform.